Just this week, in the meantime, we saw Ghana's utility regulator sharply increase the price of electricity and water for the first time in more than 2 years, saying the utility companies needed the cash to improve their service. Nigeria's central bank has said it's extending a 500 billion naira fund meant to stimulate credit to, in part, the power sector. The World Bank, in the meantime, has approved a $330 million loan for Kenya to expand its national grid and support its emerging geothermal power generation, and the African Development Bank has devoted $4.82 billion, representing 51% out of its total loan disbursement in the 2009 financial year, to infrastructure development. Now, we were going to be putting the rest of the continent's power situation under review, and that with Hela Cheikhrouhou of the African Development Bank. We're struggling to get her on the line right now, but we seem to have her online right now. So let's cross over to Hela right now. Hela, clearly lots of investment being made into boosting energy sources on the continent. I've just outlined some of the initiatives that are currently underway. What's your overall view of the African power situation at the moment and the gap that persists between electricity supply and demand?
Good morning. Thank you. There are so many numbers about how severe the power shortages are across the continent. Of course, the situation varies from one country to another, but one of the studies where we participated seemed to indicate that in sub-Saharan Africa alone, more than $90 billion will be needed in the next 10 years between rehabilitation and new investment to keep up with the new demand in electricity.
Well, undeniably, we've got energy constraints hampering business and growth in a majority of the continent's economies at this stage. I listed those various strides being made to try and handle capacity constraints right now. Are we closing, in your books, the gap effectively enough? Are the right measures being taken?
Right now, several of the countries are really prioritizing investment in the energy sector. As you know, there will be, though, a gap between the moment where you put in place the needed policies and strategies and the moment when the new capacity will come on stream. So the earlier, the better to make new investments, but also to keep your long-term planning and your master planning in place to keep enough security margin in your capacity. So are we making good headways? There are increasing efforts to invest both on the public side and, more importantly, on the private side, where the increasing number of countries are creating the right enabling environment for participation by the private investors in the generation mix of energy. But we are not there yet. There is need for a lot more investment.
Well, for governments, it's pretty much like walking a tightrope at this stage, isn't it? Because if we use Ghana as a case in point, announcing plans to hike electricity tariffs this week to actually improve facilities moving forward. But of course, this has implications on the one hand on the cost of actually doing business in that country. On the other hand, the question is, can we actually afford not to go down this route?
You're absolutely right. It is, at the end of the day, necessary to consider if you don't create the level of tariffs which makes investments viable, then what is the alternative? The alternative is no electricity access, and therefore you're basically reducing your growth potential. And estimates are like, in many countries, it's at least 2% of foregone economic growth because of lack of access to electricity. So whether you look at Ghana, Senegal, South Africa, across the board, the reality is that tariffs will have to, over time, be adjusted to reflect the cost of the energy mix. However, it is necessary there to try and have differentiated tariffication for individual small consumers versus the needs of the large industrial, where if they had to rely on their own generators, the cost of electricity would be much higher.
Well, let's look at the energy mix specifically. Is diversification of energy sources being paid enough attention? We know that towards the end of last year, Kenya had learned a very harsh lesson because of its over-reliance on hydrocarbon energy sources.
Yes, vulnerability to oil and gas price volatility, especially for countries which are not producers, is macroeconomically unsustainable. And it's good that you should mention Kenya because in our view, as the African Development Bank, we engage with all of the regional member countries for their energy strategy. Kenya in particular has the potential to almost entirely rely on the renewable energy mix because they have some substantial potential in the geothermal, they have some substantial potential in the wind sector, and there are possibilities in the cogeneration in addition to their chronic reliance on hydro. It is estimated, I mean, at this stage, we are working with them on a 300 megawatt wind farm in the Lake Turkana area. When it's installed, it will have a capacity factor of 50%, and that would be the largest wind farm in sub-Saharan Africa when it is implemented. So the government is making headways and effectively also to attract private investment in Kenya, where this is going to be maybe the fifth or the sixth independent power producer.
Exactly, bringing me to my next point, because we've drawn much emphasis on government and its involvement in hyping up power capacity. We've also looked at the role institutions like the African Development Bank are playing in this regard. To what extent is privatization of the power sector on the agenda?
Actually, when you look at infrastructure sectors and the energy sector in particular in this case, what we are really considering is the desirability of public-private partnerships. It is no longer this thesis of full privatization because you recognize that energy is such a vital lifeline for economies. So when you consider how to attract private investment, it has to be a public and private partnership. In this case, for instance, when we are attracting private investors in the generation, it has to be that they have a long-term public, usually, off-taker for that energy. That's the model that we are witnessing in most countries where there is some increasing success to attract private investors. These are not merchant power plants where you sell to a mix of clients. You actually have to have on the other side a government and a public utility that has the financial health and the commitment to a healthy management that allows it to be a credible off-taker of that energy. And this is also an area where we engage actively with the government because you recognize that the public finances will not be enough and sufficient for coping with the energy growth demands. So you have to create the enabling environment for private investors, and that entails not only giving them the right legal and regulatory and institutional environment, but also giving them contractual arrangements with the public purchaser of the energy, which are sustainable
Hela,
and can foster.
An arena that we're going to be seeing massive strides being made in. We're going to unfortunately have to leave that conversation there for today. Thanks so much for your time this morning. That's Hela Cheikhrouhou of the African Development Bank.